Hello everyone, so in this video I will talk about some literature, some books and some sources of information on discus fish. Well, I will mostly talk about the books that I have, and I believe some of these books might be useful both for beginner keepers of discus fish and for experienced keepers of discus. So I will start with a beginner literature, and obviously you can find some information about discus in lots of literature on fish keeping. For example, this book is Encyclopedia of Aquarium and Pond Fish by Alderton, and it has some very basic information about discus, essentially just a couple of pages, just 2 pages, and this is a bit of an introduction to what discus are. You can't get much more from this. And this is the case with most of the general literature on fish keeping and aquarium fish. So if you're a beginner in discus keeping, I would probably recommend you this book, Discus Fish. It's part of this complete pet owner's manual. There is a series of books on different pets and different fish. And it's a very small book and it's a very short book, but it has lots of useful information, not only about different discus strains, history of discus, distribution and so on, but also it has lots of useful information about keeping discus. And if you're a beginner, you can get a lot from this book. Essentially, it introduces you into discus keeping, and it can be a very useful book even if you're fairly advanced keeper of discus. So I would certainly recommend this for beginners. It has, for example, chapters on breeding discus, chapters on diseases and so on. So lots of useful information in a relatively small book. Well, the other books that I have, it's certainly more specialist book, and it's a bit dated book, but it's a classic. It's Schmidt-Focke's discus book, and Edward Schmidt-Focke, he was the first person who started breeding discus, who created lots of different strains of discus. Well, he was not the first who bred discus, but he's certainly the person who created most of the domestic strains of discus. For example, turquoise, brilliant turquoise, cobalt, and lots of other strains of discus. And this book is pretty much his guide to breeding and keeping discus. Yes, it was written, I think, in the 1990s, so a lot of information on equipment and water chemistry is a bit dated, but otherwise it makes a very good introduction, professional introduction into discus breeding and discus keeping. He talks a lot about wild strains of discus and domestic strains, most of which were actually bred and created by himself. So that's also a very good source of information on discus. Yes, it's old, but it's an absolute classic, and it's a must-have for anyone, whether a professional discus keeper or a beginner. I will start to talk about Heiko Blair's books, and there's obviously 2 volumes on discus, volume 1 and volume 2. These are very pricey books, but you can find used second-hand copies on eBay, and they're much cheaper, but probably that's the most comprehensive or most detailed and most important book ever published on discus. I'll actually start with volume 2 because volume 2 is on domestic strains of discus. So if you are a beginner, or if you only keep domestic strains of discus, that certainly will be more interesting for you than volume 1, which is only on wild discus. And volume 2 is certainly a must-have for any discus breeder, professional discus breeder, or anyone who keeps discus for a very long time. So that it's full of useful information. There's lots of information on different strains of discus. Pretty much most of the major breeders of discus all over the world are discussed in details. How do they keep and breed their fish, and there's information on water parameters and all sorts of breeding details that you can find here. So this is a really big and useful book for people who keep domestic strains of discus. Well, it doesn't talk much or pretty much at all about wild discus, so this is a place to go for any information you might have on domestic strains. Again, it's not a book that will actually provide you some basic information on how to keep discus, because it's designed for specialist readers. It's a specialist literature, so I think there is a chapter on how to keep domestic strains of discus, but it's very short, and it's mostly to provide you some information about various strains of discus and how they were created, all the history of discus keeping and discus breeding. So now we move on to probably the most specialist book on discus, and that's volume 1 of Blair's Discus. This is probably the most detailed and most comprehensive volume on wild discus ever published. The book is only about wild discus. It provides lots of information on distribution, taxonomy, biology, habitats of wild discus, what do they eat, where do they live, what type of fish live in the same habitats. It's an absolutely great book if you're keeping wild discus, or if you're interested in keeping wild discus, and it will provide you probably the most detailed guidance on how to keep this fish. Well, it doesn't specifically talk about keeping wild discus in captivity, but it does provide you a lot of information on wild discus, which can assist you in keeping them at home. So there's for example, water parameters at different discus habitats, and you can find precisely where do your wild discus come from, because there's lots of information on different species of wild discus, where they originate and what kind of parameters, water parameters are they used to. So yeah, this is absolutely a specialist literature, and specifically for someone who keeps wild discus, and to my knowledge this is the best and the only book that provides so much information on wild discus, and it's an absolute Bible for anyone keeping wild discus. Essentially these are the books that I have on discus, and might be quite a few other books that can be similarly useful on discus, and of course you can share your views in comments. So apart from these books on discus, there's obviously lots of information online, and online in real time you can ask questions on forums and you can receive very useful answers, so you don't really have to stick only to this published literature. I would certainly recommend Simply Discus forum, which is probably the best forum of all, and it has the largest number of discus experts and discus specialists, and pretty much you can ask any kind of question there and it will be answered pretty soon. And it also contains lots of useful information on both domestic and wild discus. I would definitely recommend you to become a member of Simply Discus. I'm not really advertising it, but this is a very good source of information along with all the published literature. So yeah, I hope this video was useful, and please do share your thoughts and opinions on what type of literature, what type of information on discus do you use in your fish keeping hobby.